I'll never forget that night, rain pounding, wind howling, and an empty road slicing through the Oregon forest. My headlights swept across a black shape. A dog soaked, still eyes burning red like embers from hell. It didn't bark, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring into me as if it had been waiting forever. I opened the door. It climbed in. No command, no hesitation. From that moment on, I wasn't myself anymore, and that wasn't just a dog. If you think this is just a story about a lost animal, you're dead wrong. Growls in the dark, forest secrets, and the soul that never crossed over. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more haunting, emotional, and unforgettable storytelling episodes. Under the relentless Oregon rain, the forest was a tunnel of shadows and wet bark where headlights barely touched the edges of trees. Eliot gripped the steering wheel with one gloved hand, the other fiddling with the volume knob of the static-ridden radio. It had been a long day, longer than it should have been. He'd hiked half a mile uphill to fix the old Ong-10 repeater box, twisted a tendon in his knee doing it, and hadn't spoken to another living soul in over 30 hours, just the way he liked it. The truck rumbled down the winding road, wet gravel hissing beneath tires, while windshield wipers flung back sheets of rain with an irregular, almost angry rhythm. Eliot's knuckles were white, not from cold, from the way his thoughts clamped down the minute the world went quiet. PTSD wasn't something you switched off like headlights. It lived behind your ribs, just out of reach, flaring in moments of stillness, gripping tighter when you let your guard down. Eliot didn't let his guard down. Not anymore. Then he saw it, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. Dead center in the road. His foot instinctively hit the brake, but not too hard. The truck skidded slightly and the headlights lit it up. A dog, big, black, soaked, still. Eliot cursed under his breath. The animal didn't flinch. It stood exactly where the beams met body, shimmering from the rain, head low, but eyes raised. The eyes. He'd seen eyes like that once, on a man pinned beneath rubble in Kandahar, half his face missing, but still alive for a few more breaths. These eyes didn't plead or panic. They stared through. Eliot rolled the window down a crack. "Hey," he called, voice cutting through the rain. "You all right out here?" No reaction. The dog's body was lean, almost gaunt. Its fur, where it hadn't matted from mud and blood, clung to its ribs. A patch of fur near the right shoulder looked like it had been burned long ago. Not recent old scarring. Its tail hung low, unmoving. Eliot shifted the truck into park and hesitated. The rational part of him, trained, methodical, told him to stay inside, let the animal move on. This wasn't his problem. Could be dangerous, could be rabid, but something heavier than logic pressed down. A weight in his chest he couldn't explain. He stepped out. The rain immediately soaked through his coat collar. Boots sank half an inch into the gravel as he moved forward, slow and cautious. "I'm not going to hurt you," Eliot said, holding his palms out. The dog didn't budge, didn't growl, just kept watching him with that unbearable stillness. 5 steps closer, and Eliot could see the dog's legs trembled. Not from fear, but exhaustion. The kind of shake a body makes when it's got nothing left to give. "You've been through hell," Eliot muttered. He crouched halfway and stopped, giving the dog enough space to bolt if it wanted. Still no movement. Just rain and those red-rimmed eyes that looked wrong. Not sick, not feral, just wrong. He waited. 30 seconds, then a minute. Then without warning, the dog took 1 step forward. Not a leap, not a lunge, just a step, then another. And then it walked slow, deliberate, right past Eliot, right toward the open passenger door of the truck. Eliot turned with it, too stunned to speak. The dog looked up at the cab, made a low, breathy sound, half a grunt, half a sigh, and jumped up. 1 paw. Then 2. It slid a little, adjusted, and sat. Not curled, not panicked. Sat like it had been invited, like it knew. Eliot stood in the rain a few more seconds, blinking it out of his lashes, heart thudding. He wasn't in the mood for strange. He wasn't in the mood for company. But there it was. A soaked, scarred dog sitting in his truck like it had a right to be there. He got in slowly, glanced sideways. The dog didn't look at him anymore. Its eyes now stared through the windshield, watching the road ahead. Eliot turned the key. The engine groaned awake. They drove in silence for several miles. Just the sound of tires and water and breath. At the bend near Hollow Creek, Eliot heard himself say it soft, unthinking, like it had been sitting in his mouth the whole time. "Harvey." The dog blinked. Eliot frowned, glancing over. "Harvey," he said again. It wasn't a name he'd used before, not for a dog, not for anything. But it fit. Harvey didn't acknowledge. It didn't react. But the cab suddenly felt less cold. Back at the cabin, Eliot killed the engine and let the headlights illuminate the clearing. The rain hadn't eased, and the pines around his home shimmered like oil paintings under moonless dark. He opened the door. "Let's go." Harvey jumped out before Eliot could offer help. He limped on the front right leg, but didn't stop moving. Not until he reached the wooden porch steps and sat waiting. Eliot unlocked the door. The cabin creaked open. He flicked on a single lamp in the corner. The place smelled like old pine metal tools and firewood, Eliot's kind of clean. Harvey stepped inside without hesitation, paws leaving wet imprints on the floorboards. He sniffed once toward the fireplace, then circled 3 times and lay down. No shaking, no whimpering, no sign of hunger. Just a strange anchored quiet. Eliot pulled off his coat and boots. From the rack above the counter, he grabbed a towel, one of the good ones, and set it down beside Harvey. "You're gonna ruin my rugs, you know." Harvey didn't look up. Eliot crouched beside him. The dog's breath was shallow but steady. Eliot reached out slowly and brushed 2 fingers along the soaked fur near Harvey's ear. The dog flinched just a twitch, but didn't move away. "You're a mess," Eliot whispered. "But you knew where you were going, didn't you?" Harvey's eye opened, met his just for a second, then closed again. Eliot stood, poured himself a glass of tap water, and sat in the armchair near the window. His hand hovered over the light switch. Outside, the forest groaned with wind and water. Inside, a scarred dog lay on the wood floor like a storm had delivered him. And Eliot, for the first time in over 5 years, didn't feel alone. He didn't know why Harvey was here, or how he got there, or what he might bring with him. But something inside Eliot, a voice buried deep under layers of sand and scar, whispered something he hadn't let himself hear in years. This matters. And when he finally turned off the light, the only thing left glowing in the dark was Harvey's open eye. Watching, waiting, remembering. Under normal circumstances, Eliot would have chalked it up to stress the silence after too much noise, the echoes a brain makes when it's alone too long. But Harvey made the silence heavier. He didn't bark, didn't eat, didn't sleep, not in any way Eliot could see. He just sat or stood for hours staring into the forest like he was waiting for something to crawl back out of it. It started the first night right after Eliot laid out the blanket beside the fireplace and filled an old steel bowl with leftover stew. Harvey didn't touch it, didn't sniff it. He just pressed his chest to the cold floorboards, head low, and locked eyes with the front door. Eliot had gone to bed, assuming maybe the dog was adjusting. It was a new place, new smells. Maybe trauma needed more time to thaw. But around 1:00 a.m., Eliot had jolted awake not to noise, but to absence. The cabin was darker than usual. He blinked at the ceiling pulse, still slow, until he noticed the faint creak of the porch step. Not loud, not aggressive, just weight shifting where no weight should be. He got up barefoot, every instinct from another lifetime sharpening in his blood. When he reached the front window, he didn't turn on the light, just peeled back the curtain 2 inches with the tip of his finger. Harvey stood in the clearing. Rain had stopped. The trees were perfectly still, and Harvey wasn't looking at the woods. He was looking into them, not sniffing, not scanning, staring. Eliot watched for maybe 3 minutes. Breath held the whole time, then finally opened the door just enough to whisper Harvey. The dog didn't turn. His ears twitched slightly like the name meant something in a forgotten language. Then slowly, he stepped forward 1 foot, then another, disappearing into the black between the trees. Eliot didn't follow, not that night, but he didn't sleep either. The next morning, Harvey was back. Dry, but dirtier than before. His fur carried streaks of what looked like ash, smudged into the coarse black like finger paint. Eliot noticed something else too. His right front paw left a small reddish print on the porch floor. Not mud, not paint. Something thinner. It was blood. But Harvey wasn't limping. Eliot crouched down, reached carefully toward the paw. Harvey didn't flinch. He let Eliot lift it, turn it gently. No cuts, no punctures. Pads intact, clean. The blood wasn't his. Eliot cleaned the print with an old rag, but it left a smear on the wood, one he kept glancing back at even hours later while splitting firewood. The next night it happened again. 13 a.m. on the dot. Eliot had looked at the clock by instinct, then froze, breath caught. 1:13. That number wasn't random. That was the exact minute an IED had gone off in Al Maroof district, shattering Eliot's left eardrum and sending 2 men from his unit into the sand in pieces. He hadn't remembered that timestamp in years. Now Harvey, this strange mutt with heat behind his eyes and blood in his fur, was walking into the forest every night at that exact time. When Harvey returned the 3rd morning, Eliot was waiting with a warm towel. The dog stopped at the porch step, cocked his head, and allowed himself to be dried like a ritual. Eliot wiped off chunks of what looked like rotted wood, little flakes crumbling between his fingers. And again, just like before, a faint trace of blood along the underbelly, thin, almost brushed on. No wound. That's when Eliot started recording. He set up the old trail cam, one of the motion sensor models he used during his brief flirtation with hunting years ago. He rigged it to cover the front yard all the way to the tree line. Then he waited. The footage the next morning didn't offer answers, only more unease. At 1:12:48 a.m., Harvey stirred, rose slowly from his position by the fireplace, stretched once, then padded silently toward the door. Eliot had left it cracked open this time. He watched as Harvey pushed it wider with his snout slipped through and vanished into the trees. Exactly at 1:13 Nodra, the timestamp blinked. And then, a flicker, just a single frame. At the edge of the camera's range, someone moved. A blur, low to the ground, then gone. Eliot rewound the clip 5 times, froze the frame, zoomed in. It wasn't Harvey. It was too small, too hunched, like a child on hands and knees. He stared at the frozen image until the battery on the trail cam died. By the end of the week, Eliot had stopped sleeping entirely. He kept a log on yellow legal paper times Harvey left, what state he returned in, and notes on what stuck to his fur. One morning, he pulled a small rusted nail from behind Harvey's ear. Another day, he found a piece of what looked like burned fabric, the size of a child's sock. And still Harvey ate nothing. No kibble, no meat, not even the boiled chicken Eliot offered from his own plate. But he didn't seem to weaken. If anything, Harvey seemed more alert, more intentional. Like the forest was giving him something he needed. Eliot started locking the door at night, not to keep Harvey in, to keep something else out. Because now when Harvey left, Eliot felt the absence not just as emptiness, but as exposure. Like something might notice he was watching. That he knew. And one night, 7 Eliot woke not to silence, but to laughter. High, sharp, childlike, far off. From the trees, he stumbled out of bed, adrenaline flooding. The clock read 1:17 a.m. He flung the door open and shouted Harvey. No answer. Just trees unmoving. He took a step forward, flashlight and handbeam, slicing through the fog. Then he saw them. 2 muddy footprints, bare, small, on the porch leading toward the door, and a single long black hair lying between them. Harvey didn't return that night. Eliot sat by the door until dawn rifle across his lap hand, trembling in a way it hadn't since his worst days overseas. When Harvey finally returned at 6:42 a.m., he was limping slightly. His right hind leg dragged a little. Eliot didn't ask why. He only whispered, "Where the hell are you going, Harvey?" But the dog didn't answer. He only looked at him, and this time there was something human in the eyes. Not warmth, not pain, but purpose. And Eliot, without understanding a single damn thing, whispered, "You're not just a dog, are you?" Harvey blinked, then lay down on the porch head, resting against the doorframe. And Eliot, for the first time since the war, cried. Not out of fear, not even grief. Out of the unbearable feeling that someone else was watching them from the dark. And that whatever Harvey was doing out there every night, it wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Under the weight of 7 sleepless nights and a silence thick enough to cut with a blade, Eliot finally broke. Not in the way most men do. He didn't scream or collapse or drink until the world stopped spinning. No, Eliot broke inward in the quiet way soldiers do when their body stays upright, but their grip on what's real starts to tear at the edges. It started with the dream. He was back in the woods, but not as himself. He was smaller, lighter barefoot. The trees didn't tower. They loomed, each one pulsing with a kind of dread, like the forest itself was breathing. Ahead of him, Harvey walked, though it wasn't the Harvey he knew. This one was taller, almost stretched in the limbs. His gait was slower, his shape constantly shifting between canine and something not quite animal. Eliot followed wordless. They reached a clearing where the earth was torn open, a raw wound in the soil. Harvey stopped at the edge and stared down. Eliot leaned forward, heart clenching. From the darkness below came a sound he hadn't heard in decades. A child crying, but not just crying, begging. Please, please, I want to go home. Then silence. Then earth groaning as if something was alive underneath. Eliot jolted awake, body drenched in sweat sheets tangled around him like restraints. He sat up gasping, chest tight, fingers trembling. For a full minute, he didn't remember where he was. The cabin's shadows felt unfamiliar. Too still. Too quiet. Then came the scratching. He stumbled to the window expecting to see Harvey at the edge of the tree line again. But this time the sound came from behind the house. Lower, slower. He followed it around the back boots, crunching against early frost. The air was sharp and metallic, and there he was, Harvey half submerged in a hole he had clawed under the far corner of the backyard. His shoulders were coated in mud. His breath came in shallow huffs. Eliot's flashlight cut a thin cone through the dark, catching the dirt the root systems torn apart, and then he stopped breathing. Lying in the fresh earth, half covered in roots and clay, was a small bone. White, smooth, too smooth. Eliot dropped to his knees, shoving Harvey gently aside. His fingers calloused from a lifetime of holding weapons, and wrenches shook as he picked it up. He knew the shape, a radius, human, and small. He stared at it, blinking once, twice, as if the thing might vanish. Harvey stood beside him now, unmoving, his breath steaming in the cold. There was no growl, no reaction, just presence. Eliot bagged the bone in a sandwich bag from the cabin and called the county sheriff the next morning. They came with measured skepticism. Boots too clean for this kind of soil, hands resting lazily on belt loops. Could be animal, one said. Could be nothing, another added. Dogs dig up all kinds of crap. Eliot watched them sweep half-heartedly with ground-penetrating gear eyes, glazing over before they even reached the hole. They handed the bag back with a shrug. Could be old. Could be from a deer. Hard to say, but it's shaped like a child's arm. The deputy looked at Eliot. You got kids, sir? No. Then maybe don't jump to conclusions. That night, Eliot couldn't sit still. He walked the perimeter of the yard 6 times before returning inside. Harvey lay by the hearth again, eyes tracking him, but saying nothing. Eliot poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, not a habit, not anymore, and sat by the window. It wasn't just the bone. It was the dream. It was the fact that the time on the microwave blinked 1:13 again, and Harvey didn't move. Not this time. He just stared at Eliot. And Eliot, despite everything, despite the wars, the trauma, the things buried so deep in him they no longer had names, felt small, felt seen. He fell asleep in the chair, drink untouched. The second dream came colder. He was standing before a wooden shack in the middle of a forest, clearing the planks warped and blackened, the nails rusted like teeth. No roof, no door, just darkness inside. And the crying again. But it wasn't coming from within. It was beneath. He dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the dirt floor. Cold. I'm so cold. I want to go home. I want to go home. Eliot's hands clawed at the soil, frantic, but the earth wouldn't give. Then came a hand, tiny, shooting from beneath, fingers broken and reaching. It touched his arm, only there was no face attached to it. Just a blur, like someone had smeared its head away. He woke up screaming, for the first time in years. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His vision blurred. The walls pulsed. The air thickened like smoke. His lungs betrayed him. He dropped to his knees, face against the cold floorboard, heartbeat spiking into chaos. Then, a pressure, gentle, at his wrist. A wet nose, then warmth. Harvey. The dog was lying beside him now, licking his wrist. Not in the eager, oblivious way dogs sometimes do, but slow, rhythmic, intentional. Eliot clenched his eyes shut, tried to speak, couldn't. But the licks continued. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Again, a pattern, like counting down. And just like that, the spiral broke. He inhaled, air returned, panic loosened. His hands found the dog's fur and gripped hard like an anchor. Harvey didn't flinch, didn't move, only looked at him with those damn eyes, like he knew exactly what was happening, like he'd done this before, like he was waiting for Eliot to remember something he hadn't faced yet. Over the next 3 days, Eliot avoided the backyard. He didn't check the hole, didn't call the sheriff again, but he started noticing things, small things. A sock, a child's sock, washed up near the creek bed at the edge of the property. Threadbare, pink. A crayon stub half melted left on his porch step. A drawing taped to the inside of his mailbox. Stick figures. A house. A tree. And next to them, a large black dog with a red dot for an eye. There was no name, no return address, just that picture. Eliot brought it inside, sat with it in his lap for an hour. Then, without understanding why, he reached for his service pistol and checked the chamber. Loaded. Something was coming. Something was already here. He looked at Harvey, who had resumed his nightly position at the window. Eliot crossed the room, lowered himself beside the dog, and rested his hand between the worn shoulder blades. Harvey didn't turn, but his tail tapped once, then stopped, and Eliot whispered, "What are you trying to show me?" The answer didn't come in words. It came in the way Harvey's body stiffened a moment later, how his ears twitched toward the trees, how his eyes narrowed, and how Eliot for the first time believed he wasn't being haunted. He was being summoned. Eliot had never followed anything into the forest. Not deer, not foxes, not shadows. But that night, he followed Harvey. The clock on the stove had just blinked past 1:13 a.m., and the dog had already risen. No hesitation, no glance back. Just that same steady pace, that same low hum of purpose that Eliot still didn't understand. But something was different this time. Harvey hadn't gone out the front door. He went around toward the back, toward the tree line where the old fence had rotted and caved. Eliot stood at the threshold for a long moment, heart hammering. His boots weren't even on. He grabbed the flashlight, the old hunting knife from the drawer, and stepped out barefoot into the dew-slick grass, into the dark. Harvey didn't look back once. The woods weren't quiet. They never really were. But that night they felt hushed in a new way. Not peaceful, expectant. Like something had opened its eyes just beyond the light. Harvey moved with precision, weaving between trees and moss-covered logs, threading a path Eliot could swear hadn't existed 24 hours ago. A path that ducked beneath bent boughs and skirted around stones, shaped like half-buried grave markers. It wasn't just off the map. It wasn't on anything. At one point, Eliot hesitated, breath clouding the beam of his flashlight. "Harvey," he whispered, voice cracking from tension. "Where the hell are you taking me?" Harvey didn't stop. But he let out a low, breathy sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. A warning. Or maybe a reassurance, or both. And then the trees opened. Eliot stepped into a clearing so overgrown with ivy and deadfall that he nearly missed it at first. A cabin, or what used to be one, sat slumped into the earth like a collapsed lung. The roof had given way on one side. Vines had claimed the rest. It was almost invisible, swallowed by time and neglect. Harvey stopped. He was perfectly still, ears forward, eyes locked on the structure. Eliot took another step forward and froze. The smell. It hit him like a memory from a battlefield. Rot and rust and mold and something else. Something older. He swallowed, lifted the flashlight, and scanned the ruin. The front door hung open, crooked on one hinge. Inside, only shadows. But Harvey moved closer now, slow, deliberate, sniffing the air with intensity. And then he growled. Not loud, not feral, but deep. A sound that said, "This is it." Eliot stepped to his side. "You brought me here for a reason," he murmured. Harvey's nose dropped into a warped floorboard just inside the threshold, where half the boards had buckled. Then he pawed at it. Once, twice. Eliot crouched, heart drumming, and listened. At first, nothing. Then, a breath. Small, ragged. Then, a chain. A faint clink, metal on metal. Then something else. A whimper. Eliot's blood turned to ice. He dropped the flashlight to the floor, letting the beams settle against the board Harvey had marked. His fingers moved on instinct, prying, pulling, wedging the blade of the knife into the gap. The board creaked, then cracked. He peeled it back with both hands and recoiled. A square opening. Dirt, roots, and a face. No, not a face. A child. A boy. Curled beneath the cabin floor, his skin streaked with filth and dried blood, his ribs sharp against his chest. Eyes wide, hair matted. Barely clothed, just a torn undershirt and boxers. One ankle was chained to a spike hammered into the dirt wall. Eliot gasped. "Jesus." The boy flinched at the sound. Hey, no, it's okay." Eliot stammered, hands up. "I'm here to help you. You hear me, buddy? I'm not going to hurt you." The child didn't answer, just stared. Harvey lay down at the edge of the hole and whined low, soft and steady. That did something. The boy blinked. His lips parted and a broken whisper slid out. "Don't take me away." Eliot's voice cracked. "No, I'm getting you out." His hands moved fast now, checking the chain, inspecting the bolt. It was crude old hand-forged, probably hammered in by someone who thought no one would ever come looking. Eliot took the knife and started to work at the dirt around it. "You got a name?" he asked gently. The boy's head turned slightly, but he didn't speak again. Just stared at Harvey. "I'm Eliot," he said. "That's Harvey. He found you." A pause. Then so faint he almost missed it, Noah. Eliot stopped digging for a second, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "Okay, Noah. That's a strong name. You're doing good, all right. Just keep looking at Harvey." It took him 10 more minutes to loosen the anchor, enough to slip the boy's foot free. When the chain came loose, the boy gasped, not in pain, but in disbelief. Like freedom was a foreign idea. Eliot reached down and lifted him carefully. The child weighed nothing. Just bones and air and fear. He turned and Harvey was already standing ready. "Lead us out," Eliot said. The dog turned and padded forward, retracing the trail with uncanny precision. Eliot followed Boy in his arms, heart beating not just from adrenaline, but from something else, something deep and unspeakable. Gratitude. They didn't speak during the walk. There was only the sound of the wind, picking up the leaves rustling overhead, and Harvey's paws moving like he knew exactly how much time they had left. Back at the cabin, Eliot kicked the door open and laid Noah on the couch. He grabbed the emergency blanket from the hallway, wrapped him, checked his pulse, checked for injuries. No bruises, no burns, but trauma written into every inch of his posture. He picked up the phone. 911. The dispatcher asked questions. Eliot answered them without knowing how he remembered the words. Name, address, child found. Approximate age 6, male, weak but conscious. By the time he hung up, Harvey had curled beside the couch. Noah's hand, tiny filthy, reached out and rested against Harvey's chest. The dog didn't move, didn't breathe, just stayed. Eliot sat back against the wall, his knees finally buckling beneath the weight of the moment. The sirens would come, but it wouldn't be the police that had saved that boy. It wouldn't be the veteran or the uniform or the phone call. It was the dog who didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't stop. The dog who knew exactly where the ghosts were buried and wasn't afraid to dig them up. The boy in Eliot's arms was weightless, not just in body, but in presence, as if life hadn't fully returned to him yet. His skin felt like paper through the thermal layer Eliot had wrapped around him, and every few steps Eliot had to shift his grip just to reassure himself that Noah was still breathing. Harvey led limping, but purposeful. His black silhouette moved through the trees like a ghost with a mission. Eliot followed, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his jaw. Snow had started to fall, light crystalline, barely enough to leave prints, but it made the world quieter. Too quiet. Eliot was halfway across the clearing when the light hit them. A bright beam, too steady to be accidental, sliced through the dark and landed squarely on his chest. "Don't move." The voice came sharp and cold. Male. Local by the accent. Not a drunk, not a hiker. This was a man who'd been here before. Eliot froze. Instinct took over. He shifted Noah protectively against his body, raised one hand with palm open. "We need help," he said. "The kid was locked under your floor." The flashlight dropped slightly. But what replaced it was worse. A gun, black, raised. "Put him down," the man said. Eliot's mind raced. "You don't want to do this. Put him down." The man repeated, more forceful this time. Then came the low growl. From Harvey. The dog standing to Eliot's left shoulders bristled despite his limp. His teeth bared. A deep, primal vibration rolled through his chest. The flashlight flicked toward him. The man stiffened. "Call off your dog." Eliot didn't speak. "Call him off, or I swear." Harvey lunged. It happened in a blink, pure instinct, muscle on bone. The dog launched at the man's gun arm, teeth snapping around wrist momentum, crashing both of them into the snow. The flashlight flew. The gun fired. A shot cracked into the night. Eliot ducked, shielding Noah as he hit the ground, snow biting through his jeans. Then silence. Then Harvey's whimper. Sharp. Cut off. Eliot rolled, adrenaline overtaking thought. The man had twisted out from under Harvey and was scrambling for the weapon, fingers red from where the dog had torn into him. Harvey was slumped in the snow, twitching, blood blooming across his left side like ink in water. Eliot moved before he could think. He grabbed a thick branch from the snowbank, heavy wet, and slammed it against the man's back. Once. Twice. The gun clattered out of reach, but the man turned fast, grabbing Eliot by the coat and driving him backward into a rotting log. They rolled, grappling. The man was strong, sinewy, not young but not weak. And Eliot was gone. Gone from the woods, gone from Oregon. He was back in sand, in the heat, in the screech of metal and smell of blood. A body in his hands. A scream behind him. A child beneath rubble. The flash, the blast, the roar. PTSD didn't warn you. It hijacked you. And Eliot was flying now, fists hammering the man's face. Knuckles splitting open, breath ragged like a dying engine. The man gasped. "You don't know what you're doing." Eliot's voice was hoarse. "You left a kid to die." "I was saving him." Eliot headbutted him. Hard. The man sagged, dazed. And then, creak. Snap. Above them. Eliot had just enough time to roll. The woodpile stacked high, years of timber hoarded beneath a lean-to collapsed. The top beam cracked free, snapping downward like a guillotine. It caught the man full across the back. Eliot heard the ribs break, the breath leave. Then stillness, utter suffocating stillness. He crawled out from the debris snow, soaking his clothes. His hands shook. His pulse rattled in his ears like static. He stared at the heap of wood where the man had fallen. No movement, no more fight. He didn't feel relief, just numb. Noah. The boy was still curled on the ground where Eliot had dropped him, shivering, eyes wide. Eliot staggered over and picked him up. Then he saw Harvey, still breathing but barely. Blood stained the snow beneath him, dark and alarming. His eyes fluttered open, locking with Eliot's. "I got you," Eliot whispered. He pressed his coat against the wound. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Eliot pulled his phone from his pocket, hands fumbling through the lock screen. The touchpad was wet. Cold. He jabbed at it, missing numbers. Come on. Finally dialing. 911, what's your emergency? He spoke fast. Too fast. Location. Coordinates. Gunshot. Child recovered. Dog hit. Suspect down. The dispatcher's voice was calm, clinical. Eliot hated it. Stay on the line, sir. He dropped the phone in the snow, crouched over Harvey. The dog's chest rose and fell with effort. Eliot didn't know what to say, so he just pressed both hands into the coat, into the wound, into the heat, and whispered, "Stay with me. Please." Snow kept falling, light, soft, the kind that should have been peaceful. But on that night, in that clearing, with blood on the ice and a child barely breathing, it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Hospitals had a smell Eliot could never get used to. Sterile, faintly metallic, and something colder beneath it, like resignation left too long under fluorescent light. He sat in the corner of the pediatric recovery room, hands resting on his knees, boots still flecked with snowmelt. Noah was across the room, silent, curled in the too large hospital bed, like a question mark drawn in pencil. The nurses had cleaned him up, wiped the dirt from his skin, replaced his ragged clothes with pale cotton scrubs. But they couldn't touch the look in his eyes, like the world was still holding him by the ankle. He hadn't said a word, not to the nurses, not to the officers, not even to Eliot. But when they handed him crayons and a sheet of paper, he took them. Now he was drawing. The first few lines were shakily etched, uncertain, barely forming anything. Then gradually they became clearer. A crooked square for a shack, a tree, 2 stick figures, and beside them, a dog, big, black, with 1 red dot for an eye. Eliot stood, walked slowly to the bedside. Noah glanced up just for a second. "I know him too," Eliot said, voice soft. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't flinch either. That was something. The investigators had returned to the shack. Eliot hadn't gone with them. He didn't have to. He knew what they would find, or at least what they couldn't ignore anymore. Detective Sarah Lynn, who looked too tired to be in any kind of authority, sat across from Eliot later that day at the station. Her hands were clean, but her eyes weren't. There were things under the floor, she said. Old stuff. Kids' stuff. Eliot didn't respond. She reached into the folder and pulled out photos gloves. In evidence bags, torn children's books, what looked like the toe of a shoe melted into plastic, found remains of a small mattress, chain points bolted to beams in multiple corners. That place wasn't meant for 1 child. Eliot took a long breath. "How many?" She paused. "Hard to say exactly. But we're cross-checking DNA with missing persons files. The earliest item we dated goes back to 2011. There are at least 3 active missing children cases in this county alone that match the time frame." A beat of silence passed. Then Sarah leaned forward. "How did you find it?" Eliot looked up. "I followed my dog." She stared. "No joke. No joke." Sarah flipped a page in the file. "You said the dog brought you there. On his own. He's the reason Noah's alive." Sarah was silent a moment. Then Animal Control tried scanning him at the clinic. No chip. Eliot nodded. No collar. No tag. No registration in the county. He's not in the state rescue database either. "He doesn't belong to anyone," Eliot said. Sarah looked unconvinced. "Dogs don't just show up out of nowhere and lead people to victims in the middle of the night." Eliot leaned forward now, elbows on the desk. "You weren't there." "No, I wasn't." Another pause. Then she asked, "So where did he come from?" It was a question Eliot couldn't shake. Harvey had been moved to a private vet facility across the county. The bullet had missed vital organs, but barely. Eliot visited twice a day, sitting beside the kennel, while Harvey recovered under heat lamps and slow drips of antibiotics. The vet, a man named Ruiz, told Eliot, "It's a miracle he lived, let alone walked back after." Eliot didn't call it a miracle. He called it unfinished business, because Harvey wasn't done. Eliot knew it, felt it in his bones. So he started looking. He drove to the local animal control, asked about rescues, feral sightings, shelters, foster failures. Nothing. Harvey didn't exist. Then he thought bigger. He visited the local library, an old brick building that smelled like water damage and forgotten ideas. A teenager behind the counter helped him search through archived newspapers' community board announcements, scanned copies of newsletters from decades past. And there, buried in a folded photocopy of a 2014 edition of the Polk County Sentinel, he found it. "Fire destroys animal sanctuary off Miller's Grove." The article was short. No photos, no follow-up. But the details were enough. The shelter Miller's Grove Rescue Sanctuary had housed over 30 animals, mostly strays, mostly dogs. Run by a volunteer couple. Remote location. The fire had started overnight. Suspected electrical. 5 animals confirmed lost. Many unaccounted for. The owners were hospitalized for smoke inhalation and never reopened. Eliot stared at the words, "many unaccounted for." And then his eyes locked on the one accompanying quote. "He always ran to the woods when he got scared," said L. Harrison, co-founder. But he always came back. No name, no photo, but Eliot knew who they were talking about. He folded the paper slowly like it might crumble under pressure. Then he drove. Miller's Grove was almost gone. Trees had overgrown the gravel road moss, swallowing the old sign. The fence was down in 3 places. The main barn had collapsed inward like a broken rib cage. Eliot walked through the ruins with his flashlight, even though it was still daylight. There wasn't much left, ashes and memories. But behind the barn, he found a low fence line, a circle of stones, and a faded wooden plaque nailed to a rotting post, the name carved into it. Shadow. Underneath it, barely legible. A good dog, a brave one. Eliot stepped back, breath frozen in his chest. Shadow, a common name maybe, but also a shape of presence. A dog, a protector. Harvey. He turned in a slow circle, staring into the surrounding forest. Was it possible? Could a dog survive fire abandonment and still keep watch? Could he cross over from whatever was beyond and come back? And if he could, for what? Eliot didn't speak the thought aloud. He just stood there alone in a forgotten place, feeling the eyes of the trees press against his skin. And in that moment, for the first time since Afghanistan, Eliot didn't feel like a soldier anymore. He felt like a witness to something older, something sacred, something that wasn't finished yet. The rain had returned. Not a storm this time, but a steady, almost rhythmic drizzle that made the world outside Eliot's truck feel like a VHS tape on rewind, soft, grainy, trapped in memory. He sat in the parking lot of Clearwater Pines' retirement home engine, off fingers wrapped tight around a photograph that didn't belong to him. He'd found it in a forgotten frame behind a bookshelf at the town library. Someone had donated a box of old newsletters and photos from local shelters and charities. Most were sun-faded, curling at the corners. But this one had survived. It showed a young girl no older than 10 sitting in a wheelchair. Her smile was big open, the kind only children make before the world teaches them caution. But it wasn't the girl that stopped Eliot's heart. It was the dog in her arms. Black, large, scarred, same posture, same eyes. It was Harvey. Or it had been. The name in cursive at the bottom corner read, Emily and Shadow, 2013. Eliot now held that photo like it might vanish from his hands. He didn't knock when he entered Clearwater Pines. He simply asked for Emily Rosewell. The nurse at the front desk didn't look surprised. She doesn't get many visitors, she said. Emily was in the sunroom. No wheelchair now, just an old woman with paper-thin skin and hair like spider silk staring out the window, as if waiting for something specific. Eliot approached, cleared his throat. Ma'am, I think I found someone you lost. She turned her head. Her eyes didn't register him at first. Then they dropped to the photo in his hands. For a moment, nothing. Then a long exhale like air escaping from years of silence. Shadow, she whispered. Eliot pulled up a chair beside her. You knew him. Her hand reached trembling, brushing the photo with fingers curled like wilted petals. He wasn't just a dog, she said. He was something more. Eliot didn't speak. He didn't have to. He came to the shelter after someone dumped him in a sack on the roadside. She continued. Didn't trust anyone. Took him 6 weeks to let anyone touch him, except me. I was broken too. She smiled gently. Shadow never barked, never ran. He just watched, like he was waiting. For what, Eliot asked. She looked out the window again. For the next child who wouldn't make it out. Eliot's throat tightened. He knew, he asked. I think he always knew. He could feel when someone was fading, or forgotten, or hidden. There was a pause. Shadow died in a fire, he said finally. She nodded. I know. I was there. I smelled his fur burn. Eliot flinched. But you believe he came back? Emily turned now, fully facing him. No, she said. I know he did. And then her voice softened. He always said goodbye before he left. Except this time he didn't. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. Shadow only comes back, she whispered. When a child's soul is trapped, he doesn't forget. That night, Eliot sat at the edge of his bed, eyes glued to Harvey. The dog hadn't moved in over an hour. He was lying by the door chest, rising slowly, but his gaze fixed to the far wall. Specifically, the old mirror Eliot had brought back from Afghanistan. It had once belonged to a remote school where he'd helped rebuild classrooms. The children had painted stars on the frame. Now Harvey refused to look at it. When Eliot tried to call him over, Harvey shifted but kept his head down. Then, as if the mirror had suddenly started humming, Harvey stood and backed into the shadows. Not with fear, with shame. Eliot didn't know what unnerved him more, that Harvey feared his own reflection, or that the mirror stayed cold, no matter how warm the room became. That night, the dream returned, but differently. Eliot wasn't himself anymore. He was Harvey. He could feel the shift in his limbs, the tension of muscle and instinct. The world was lower sounds, sharper. And everything burned. The trees were on fire. The ground cracked beneath paws as he ran, not from the fire, but toward it. Toward the screams. There were voices, high-pitched, terrified. Children. He reached the building. Barked, clawed, snarled. But the humans ran the other way. Smoke filled his nose. He forced through a shattered window. Inside, a girl, her face obscured by light, curled under a table. He nudged her. She wouldn't move. He howled. Then silence. Then pain. Then darkness. He woke up choking on his own breath. The next morning, Harvey refused food. Eliot placed the bowl down anyway, waited. Harvey only stared at it, then slowly backed away. Buddy, Eliot said gently. What are you afraid of? He followed Harvey's eyes. They were fixed on the mirror again, only now there was something new. A mark, faint, barely visible. But it hadn't been there the day before. A small, smoky handprint. At waist height, child-sized. Eliot's blood ran cold. He stood slowly, walked to the mirror. The glass was clean, untouched. But the mark wouldn't wipe away. Not with water, not with alcohol, not even with steel wool. It wasn't dirt. It was memory, burned into reflection. He went back to Clearwater Pines that afternoon. But Emily's room was empty. The nurse told him she passed in her sleep. Peacefully, the photo still on her nightstand. No family had come. Eliot stood outside the facility in the drizzle, staring up at the gray sky. He didn't cry. He couldn't. Some wounds don't bleed. They echo. That evening, Harvey stood at the edge of the forest again. Same position as the first night. Same silence. But this time Eliot joined him. Where now, he asked. Harvey didn't move. Then, after several seconds, he turned not into the woods, but toward the road. Eliot followed without asking. Because some journeys don't require maps. Only faith. Noah spoke for the first time 3 days after the rain stopped. His voice was barely a whisper, a sound like leaves brushing across wood. Eliot had just stepped into the hospital room when Noah turned toward him and muttered, "She's still there." Eliot paused. "Who's still there, kiddo?" Noah looked at him with eyes that no child should have to wear. "Lily." That was all he said, but it was enough. Lily, his sister. Not a memory, a presence, a truth still breathing somewhere out there. That same night, Eliot stood in front of the fireplace, holding the drawing Noah had made earlier. It was crude but undeniable, 2 stick figures, a boy and a girl inside a jagged shape that looked like a cave. And beside them, a black dog with glowing red eyes standing guard. Harvey, who hadn't left the front porch since they brought Noah back. Harvey, who hadn't barked, eaten, or blinked more than twice. Harvey, who now stood up, looked Eliot in the eyes and growled. Not at Eliot, at the forest. By dawn, Eliot had already called Sheriff Rayner. The search teams had combed most of the known trails, but none had explored the dense eastern ridge, too steep, too remote, too easy to get lost. But Eliot wasn't guessing. He was following Harvey. They hiked for hours, Harvey always a few paces ahead, occasionally stopping ears, twitching nose lifting into the wind like a living compass. Eliot trailed behind, shotgun strapped across his back, radio clipped to his vest boots, sinking into the mossy undergrowth. Then Harvey stopped, right in front of a thick wall of brush, nearly invisible, unless you were looking for it. Behind it, black rock. A cliff face curved like a wave frozen in stone. And at the base, a shadow, a hole, not quite a cave, not quite a den, but something in between. And Harvey growled again, this time low and shaking. They called for backup. While waiting, Eliot and 2 officers set up lights near the entrance, careful not to make noise. The scent inside the cave was wrong, like rust and mold and childhood forgotten. Harvey pawed the ground near a pile of old branches, underneath a boot. Tiny, blue, with a sparkly star on the side. Beside it, a doll's hand, cracked plastic. And then a photo creased, water-damaged, but legible. A school portrait. Name on the back, Lily Carson. Harvey barked once, then bolted inside. Harvey, Eliot's voice echoed through the tunnel. Then came the scream. Not Harvey's. A child. The officers rushed in with flashlights. The cave widened into a crude underground chamber, dug by hand shovels still leaning in the corner. Along the walls, hooks with ropes, shelves with canned food drawings scribbled in crayon. And in the far end, huddled under a blanket of rags, was Lily, eyes swollen, lips cracked, hands tied behind her back. She flinched at the lights, then saw Harvey, and something shifted. Her shoulders uncurled. Her mouth opened. "Dog," she whispered. Harvey walked slowly to her, nuzzled her gently, then turned and growled. From the shadows, a man stepped forward. The second captor, the brother of the first, gaunt, dirty, eyes like caves. He carried a wooden bat. And hate. Harvey lunged first. The man swung. The sound of wood against skull echoed like a gunshot. Harvey crumpled midair, slammed to the ground. Eliot screamed. Charged. The man raised the bat again, but Eliot tackled him. Fists flying, shouting names from another life, from another war, from nightmares that still bled behind his eyes. They wrestled in the dirt, kicking, clawing, until a bullet struck the cave wall. "Sheriff Rayner!" The captor froze. The officers swarmed him. Cuffs clicked shut. Lily screamed, crawled to Harvey. He wasn't moving, but his chest rose. Once. Then again. Outside the cave, paramedics carried Lily to safety. Wrapped in blankets, IV lines in her arms, but alive. She reached for Eliot's hand before the ambulance doors closed, and whispered, "He's not just a dog." Eliot stood silent beside Harvey's body, now laid gently on a stretcher covered in blood. The vet checked his pulse. Weak, but there. "He's got a shot," she said. Eliot didn't speak. He just placed his hand on Harvey's chest and whispered, "You saved them." Then the rain started again, soft, forgiving, like something washing away what never should have happened. The forest was quiet the morning after. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on your lungs and makes you hesitate to breathe. Eliot stood at the edge of the clearing where the ambulances had parked the night before, staring into the woods as if waiting for something or someone to return. But Harvey was gone. No paw prints, no blood trail, no sign of a wounded body dragging itself through leaves. Gone. 3 days passed. Eliot refused to leave. Every morning he packed a thermos of black coffee and a pouch of dry food, walked the same path into the woods, and whistled. No sound ever came back. The forest had swallowed Harvey, as it had once swallowed Noah and Lily, and every lost soul before them. Only now, it didn't return anything. Eliot combed the ravines. He checked the creek beds, climbed the fallen trees, even crawled beneath the old choy, where Noah had first been found. Nothing. On the third night, he fell asleep on the porch swing, still in his boots, the mug cold in his hand. He dreamt of fire again, but this time he wasn't running. He was standing still in the flames, watching a figure step out from the smoke. It was Harvey, whole, untouched, silent. And just before the fire consumed them both, Harvey bowed his head slowly and vanished. The next morning, Eliot found a letter on the porch, folded clean, no envelope, no stamp, no name, just one sentence written in simple ink on yellowing paper. Cảm ơn vì đã tin tưởng một linh hồn chưa được siêu thoát. Eliot stared at it for a long time, heart slamming against his ribs like it wanted to escape his chest. He flipped the paper over. Nothing. No signature. Only a single strand of black fur clinging to the crease. Not clotted with blood, not tangled with mud. Clean. Almost too clean. Like it had never touched this world. Later that day, Eliot brought the letter into town. The sheriff read it. Twice. Then looked up, his face unreadable. You sure this was from the dog? Eliot didn't answer. He didn't have to. The sheriff tapped his pen nervously. You know we've had dogs trained for rescue, for war, for therapy. But I've never seen one like him. Eliot nodded. You never will again? The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. The soldier, the recluse, the unlikely hero. You think he was a ghost? Eliot's voice didn't shake. No. A pause. He was what comes after the ghost. That week, local papers printed the story. Veteran rescues siblings in forest ordeal. Black dog leads police to hidden captivity site. They left out the details. They had to, because nobody wanted to print the truth, that the dog had appeared from nowhere. That it had known where to go, who to help, what evil to confront. That it had fought, bled, and vanished without a trace or a tombstone. That maybe, just maybe, some animals didn't belong to this world, but showed up anyway when the world failed its own. Eliot never adopted another dog. He didn't visit shelters. Didn't glance at strays in alleyways. Didn't kneel to pet golden retrievers wagging their tails at gas stations. He didn't need to. Some bonds exist beyond replacement. One night, weeks later, Eliot went up to the ridge where Harvey had first appeared. He brought nothing with him. No flashlight, no jacket. Just the drawing Noah made, the one with Harvey standing between two children. He set it down on the rock, weighed it with a stone, and sat cross-legged beside it. He didn't speak, but he felt something, like a warm breath at the back of his neck, like a heartbeat beside his own. And when the wind picked up, it didn't howl, it whispered, a low, familiar sound, as if something was finally home. The winter sun rose quiet over the town of Miller's Pine. It cast long shadows on frozen roofs and made the creek shimmer like poured mercury. But something was different this year. People walked slower, looked each other in the eye more, held their children closer, because now they knew bad things could happen, even in the quietest places. But so could miracles. Noah and Lily were placed with a couple who had lost their own daughter in a flood 7 years earlier. The woman, Claire, ran the town's only bakery. The man, Dennis, was a retired postal worker with shaking hands and a heart too big for his own body. When they first met Noah and Lily, the girl clutched her brother's shirt and refused to speak. But Claire didn't try to coax. She just placed a warm cinnamon roll in Lily's hand and whispered, "You don't have to say anything. You're already home." That night, Lily spoke for the first time in months. She said one word before falling asleep on Claire's lap. Harvey. The name became legend. In town squares, on playgrounds, around campfires. People began to share dreams, vivid ones, strange ones. Children would wake crying, whispering about a black dog standing in their bedroom doorway, watching, protecting. One boy claimed Harvey led him through a burning hallway and out a back door that wasn't real. Another girl said she saw him lying beside her hospital bed, his breath steady, his eyes closed. And a grandmother, half blind, half lucid, muttered, "The firewalker's back." This time he brought the children home. Eliot didn't correct them, didn't feed the rumors either. But every evening at 5:30, he would place a worn, checkered blanket in the corner near the fireplace, the same spot Harvey had always curled into after pacing the window. He'd light a fire, pour 2 mugs of tea, and speak aloud, just in case someone or something was listening. Sometimes he swore he heard claws on the porch, but when he opened the door, it was only snow. In the spring, Eliot surprised everyone. He adopted a new dog, a mutt with wiry brown fur, floppy ears, and an annoying habit of chasing its own tail. He named her Ivy. Not Harvey. Never Harvey. But when Ivy curled into the blanket corner one afternoon and sighed like a soul that remembered too much, Eliot's eyes burned hotter than the fire beside her. That summer, the school invited Eliot to speak. The principal wanted a story of bravery. What she got was a man with a cracked voice and a memory stitched together with pain, quiet, and moments of impossible grace. He didn't mention the gunfight, or the blood, or the weight of a dying child in his arms. He told them about the silence before the dog appeared, the weight of being found when you didn't know you were lost. And at the end, one boy raised his hand. Was Harvey real? He asked. Eliot looked him straight in the eye. No, he said, then paused. But neither is love, or hope, or forgiveness. Not until someone chooses to make them real. The room was quiet for a long time after. One night in July, during a soft rain, Claire stopped Eliot in the bakery. She held up a crayon drawing. Noah had made it. It showed two dogs. One was Ivy, clearly. The other was Harvey, drawn larger, darker, standing behind a group of children holding hands. At the bottom, in shaky 6-year-old handwriting, it read, "He goes where the lost ones are." Claire said nothing else. Eliot tucked the drawing into his coat, walked home, and sat beside the fire long after the flames died. He didn't cry, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling. By fall, townspeople started calling the old ridge Harvey's Watch. Hikers left treats at the trailhead. Children tied black ribbons to branches. Some people said that was silly. Others swore the place felt warmer, as if something was guarding it, not haunting it, just waiting. One morning, Ivy began barking at the front door. Eliot opened it. No one was there. But a set of tiny footprints led from the street to the porch and back. Too small for an adult, too clear for a ghost. And resting on the welcome mat, perfectly centered, was a smooth stone painted with the word safe. Eliot closed the door, knelt beside Ivy, and whispered, "You're not alone." She wagged her tail twice and licked his hand. That Christmas, Eliot held a gathering, his first. He didn't send invitations, didn't call it a party, just left the porch light on and set out extra mugs. By 7 o'clock, the living room was full of noise, laughter, cider, a girl's high-pitched giggle. Noah and Lily sat beside Ivy, stroking her ears. And in the corner, resting on the same checkered blanket, lay a black collar. No tags, just a single stitched word, Harvey. No one saw who placed it there, and no one asked. Eliot didn't move it. He just nodded once and threw another log on the fire. The sparks leapt high, cracked loud, and in their flicker for a moment too fast to be certain, a pair of glowing red eyes blinked from the shadows, watching, still protecting. The first sentence Eliot wrote was not for the world. It was for himself. A confession whispered onto a page. I did not save them. Harvey did. The fire crackled in the hearth beside him. Ivy lay curled in the same spot where Harvey once did chest, rising and falling slowly, but her eyes half open, as if still listening to stories from another world. Eliot stared at the title page of the book he'd begun. No publisher, no agent, no plan. Just 6 words. The Lost One Who Found Me. A memoir, a map, a reckoning. Not for fame, not for sympathy, but because there were pieces of Harvey that still breathed through the children he saved. And Eliot couldn't let them vanish like smoke in the trees. He owed that much. To Noah, to Lily, and to whatever Harvey had once been. By spring, Eliot had finished the first draft. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polished. It was full of trembling sentences, ink blots, pages wrinkled from where his hands had pressed too hard. He printed a few copies at the town library. No one expected it to do anything. But the first copy landed in the hands of a counselor at the Miller's Pine Orphan Home. 2 weeks later, Eliot was invited to speak. He almost said no, but Ivy, ever the reminder of courage and fur and patience, pawed his knee and looked up with soft eyes. So he said yes. The room was small. 10 children, 2 caretakers, 1 folding chair with bad legs. He brought the book, but didn't read from it. He told them a story about a man who forgot how to be human and a dog that reminded him by never asking him to be anything but broken. He told them about a fire that burned more than trees, about red eyes that weren't evil, only burdened, about a howl that cracked the sky open the night a boy and girl came home. He didn't dramatize, didn't soften it either, just told it as it was. When he finished, no one clapped. They just stared. One girl, maybe 8, with tangled braids and a Band-Aid on her chin, raised her hand. Did Harvey have a family? Eliot's throat tightened. He almost said no, but then he looked at Ivy, and then at the girl's eyes, and he answered yes. Every time someone remembers him, he does. He began visiting more places after that. Group homes, community centers, even a retirement village that smelled like dust and old cinnamon. Everywhere he went, he brought one worn copy of the book. He never forced anyone to listen, but they did. Sometimes not with their ears, but their stillness, their silences, their questions. One elderly man who hadn't spoken in 5 months suddenly whispered, "Black dog. I dreamed of him." Another woman wept quietly as Eliot spoke, clutching her chest like something had bloomed inside it for the first time in years. A small boy once asked if Harvey went to heaven. Eliot smiled. No, he said. He never left. There were other things too. Things that weren't explainable. A teacher reported a strange dog paw print outside her classroom on the third-floor balcony. An orderly at the hospice swore he heard panting outside a window moments before a patient passed. A woman left a baby at the fire station with a note. He deserves to grow up in a town Harvey visited. The local radio ran a segment titled The Watchdog of Miller's Pine. And slowly the town once scarred and suspicious became something else. Alert, soft, connected, as if everyone had learned that monsters don't always growl. Sometimes they look like neighbors. And sometimes salvation comes on 4 legs soaked in rain. Eliot wasn't a public figure, but his story passed like wildfire through places that needed hope. Someone translated the book into Braille. Another person printed it and left copies in waiting rooms of trauma clinics. Children drew Harvey with wings, halos, armor, but always with eyes that seemed older than the page. Eliot began receiving letters. Hundreds. Some were scribbled with crayons. Others typed in all caps. All said the same thing in different ways. Thank you for reminding me not all who are lost stay that way. Back home, Eliot still kept the blanket, still kept the black collar, still kept the tea mug beside the fire. He never said goodbye. Didn't believe in endings anymore. He only believed in echoes. One crisp October evening, Eliot hosted a reading at the town library. Noah and Lily sat in the front row. Noah held the original drawing he'd made Harvey standing behind children, eyes lit like lanterns in the dark. When the event ended, Eliot was folding his notes when a girl approached. She was no older than 7. Freckles. Dirt under her fingernails. Holding her father's hand like it was an anchor. She stared at him for a long time, then said, "I heard him in my dream." Eliot knelt, heart quiet. "Him who?" she whispered. "The dog that watched me when I was scared." Her father looked puzzled. "She just came out of a coma a month ago. Keeps talking about a big black dog." Eliot smiled. Didn't say a word, just handed her the last copy of his book. Inside he wrote, "For the ones who are found by things we never see, but always feel." She hugged the book like it had heat, then ran off. On Christmas Eve, Eliot lit a candle for Harvey. Not a vigil, not a tribute, just light. The town had changed. The forest, too. What once felt ominous now felt sacred. People hiked the woods with reverence, left toys at the old cabin site, named a trail after him, Harvey's Path. No one could explain why the moss grew thicker along that route, or why it never froze, but no one tried. Some things are meant to be felt, not proven. That night, Eliot sat by the fire. The wind howled outside like laughter. Ivy lay beside him, head tilted, as if hearing something he couldn't. He opened the book again, ran his fingers down the final page, and added one last line with shaking hands. He was never a dog. He was the echo of every child who cried for help and wasn't heard until someone finally listened. Then he closed it, and for the first time in a long time, slept without dreaming. The snow that winter was unlike any Eliot had seen in years, heavy, silent, and slow to fall, as if even the sky didn't want to interrupt what had just unfolded. He woke before dawn on Christmas morning, not because he wanted to, but because sleep had become a ritual of ghosts. For 3 nights in a row, he had dreamed the same dream, Harvey, standing at the edge of the woods, silent, glowing not from moonlight, but from something deeper, something unsaid. Eliot bundled himself in his old army coat, the one he hadn't worn in years, not because of the cold, but because of what it remembered. He stepped out with a small hand-woven wreath in his hands. Fir branches, red berries, a single black ribbon tied in a quiet loop. He walked through the thick snow, passing the last wooden fence behind his cabin down the path Harvey used to take all the way to the line of trees where the forest swallowed sound. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He bent down and placed the wreath right at the tree root where Harvey once sat every night staring toward something no one else could see. The snow around it was still undisturbed, like Harvey had never bled there, like he had never existed, or always had. Inside the fireplace, crackled low. On the table lay a stack of colored pencils beside them, a picture Noah had drawn that morning. In it, Harvey wasn't bleeding, wasn't hurt. He was walking head-high tail, relaxed, leading a long line of children through the forest. Their figures glowed amber, like morning sun cutting through fog. At the bottom corner of the drawing, in shaky but determined letters, was the message, "Chúng tôi đã không bị lạc, chúng tôi chỉ cho được tìm thấy." We weren't lost, we were just waiting to be found. Eliot stared at the image for a long time. Not because he didn't believe it, but because he did. He folded the picture and placed it gently inside his journal, beside the single black hair he had found by the doorstep. Soft, clean, as if it had never touched blood or mud or fire, as if it belonged to a soul already on its way home. Every morning, Eliot prepared 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the empty spot beside the fireplace. He never explained it to visitors. Sometimes when the light hit just right, you could almost believe the cushion bore the faint pressure of something once curled up there, a weight no longer physical, but never truly gone. Time passed. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. Noah grew taller, his drawings more complex. Lily began smiling in photographs. The town, once soaked in silence, now carried echoes of children laughing down the streets. But Eliot, though smiling more, remained anchored to something unseen. He still walked into the woods some evenings. Not to find, but to feel. Just to know the trees remembered. He carried a worn scrap of cloth in his coat pocket. Gray, faintly frayed, still faintly warm. He never told anyone. But some nights, when dreams fell too deep, he heard it again, the faint thud of paw prints on wood, just beyond the threshold of sleep. One winter years later, Eliot sat by the fire, notebook open, pen still against the paper. His eyes closed. He didn't stir again. When neighbors entered days later, they found the coffee machine still warm. 2 cups, steam still rising. Beside the fireplace, the cushion bore a fresh indentation. A single black hair lay across it, soft, clean, untouched by age or ash. The final page in Eliot's notebook had only one sentence. Some souls are sent not to stay, but to lead us home, then vanish when we no longer need them. After the credits rolled in that silent story of their lives, a faint sound echoed one final time. A soft, deliberate click of claws on wooden porch boards. Then silence and peace.